Hi, I'm Danny and these are my Diecast Disasters. In this video I'm going to be restoring and customizing this little Corgi Junior's Range Rover. So there were quite a few of these little Range Rovers they made. They seem to be around the early 80s and onwards. There were police ones and ambulance ones and rescue ones. Honestly, this little example has so much paint on it, I couldn't really work out which version it even was. This was from a load of cars that my mum sent me, so thanks mum. Taking it off the turntable to have a closer look, it is totally slathered with all sorts of colours of paint. There's black, blue, white, a bit of red. I don't really know what they were going for here. The windscreen has been totally painted over, but I'm pretty confident that under there it is actually clear, and somewhere in here there is also an interior. You can see the yellow interior hiding away in there. This is definitely the worst paint job I've come across. The first step is to take the car apart. It has two rivets that I have to drill out, and then there's a tab at the back and the grille sort of tabs in at the front a bit. When cars have this much paint on them, it's usually sticking them together to a degree, so you have to be gentle when you pry them apart. There it goes. There's that interior hidden away in there. And that windscreen actually looks in great condition underneath all that paint. It has one rivet holding it in. I drill this out. The windscreen is totally stuck in there with paint, so I have to gently take it out. I go slowly, wedging it out bit by bit with my tool here. I have to try to slowly break all the paint sticking it on there without actually breaking the plastic windscreen. There we go, out without a break. So before I get on with stripping the body of the car, I'm going to see if I can actually do something about this windscreen and the other plastic parts. I start with some hot water and a little bit of caustic soda. The plastic parts go in and they were left in here for about 5 minutes. And here they are after a rinse and a brush with my trusty toothbrush. As you can see, most of the paint is gone, and what's left on there has been somewhat weakened, so I can pretty easily scratch it off with my little tool here. Some viewers might note that when I did my Bandolero restoration and I put the clear plastic into the caustic solution, it ended up damaging it. But as you can see, it hasn't affected this clear plastic at all, which has generally been my experience, so I'm not quite sure why it happened to that particular model. I clean up the wheels and the base with my little tool as well. Here is our windscreen section after paint stripping. Now it's going to get a sand with some 1200 grit sandpaper. That's looking great. All of the visible parts are nice and clean. I finished it off with a polish. So now that I've saved the plastic parts, I'm happy to move on to stripping and painting the casting. I used some poly stripper to strip the paint off. It was actually really thick and I had to use a couple of applications. I use a wire brush on my rotary tool to clean up the remaining scraps of paint and oxidation off of the car body. Here are all the parts to clean the paint off. This is kind of the starting point for a lot of restorations. Here are the wheels cleaned up. I'm undecided if I'm going to use these yet though, as they're still looking pretty rough and beat up. There were a couple of rough areas on the casting which I cleaned up with my needle files before I painted it. There's also just a little bit of dent in the top part there, so I use my trusty drumstick method to beat it out flat. It was given a coat of matte primer and then I painted it white. I painted in some details in silver, the lights and a couple of badges. I used Photoshop to make some emergency decals for the side of it. I made the project file 4 by 5 inches, which is half the size of one of the tester's decal paper sheets. This way I can cut them in half and get more projects out of a sheet, as they're not that cheap. They work out about $5 a decal sheet. Before I started doing this, I'd have to kind of plan ahead a few projects that I wanted decals for and print them all out on one sheet, which was a bit of a pain. This way I can focus on just 1 or 2 projects at a time and it only costs me $2.50. Whenever you're making your own decals like this, you are inevitably going to mess a few of them up, so I recommend pasting a few copies of the same thing. I printed these on my inkjet printer and then gave them a good coating of the Textiles decal bonder. If you don't do this, the ink will just wash straight off them. Finally, I detail the rear lights with Tamiya clear red and the indicators with clear orange. This was all given a gloss clear coat and left to cure. Now I can move on to detailing the interior and the base. There's not much wrong with the interior, just a little bit of paint I had to scrape off it. I painted it light steel and detailed it in black. Here is the base with all the paint removed. Came out pretty good, except some of the words on the bottom where it says Range Rover sort of went all powdery and rubbed off. The Corgi Juniors and Made in Britain are still fine though. I just painted this in gunmetal. Here are the cleaned up wheels. The paint is gone pretty much, but they're still fairly beat up and crappy looking, so I'm going to replace them. I've decided to use these white rimmed ones. Here are all our parts, refurbished and repainted and ready to go back together. And so before we take a look at our finished Range Rover, let's just take a moment to look back and be reminded of what we started with. This poor little car has been totally slathered with all sorts of colours of paint. A total die-cast disaster. But I knew that somewhere under all of that paint there was a little emergency vehicle. And here it is, our restored and customised Corgi Juniors Range Rover emergency vehicle. With the terrible layers of paint gone and a nice new white paint job, some tidy new decals, cleaned up shiny windows and some nice new wheels, our little Range Rover is ready to go off on an emergency rescue mission. I think this was a great turnaround for this little toy, and it's always really satisfying to restore cars that you might think were bin worthy in other circumstances. I'll now take a moment to welcome all of my new subscribers and say my usual big thanks to everyone for the great comments and likes on my videos. It's always great reading comments from people who had these toys as children or maybe owned the actual cars in real life. And the extra special thanks to my awesome Patreon supporters. You can check out their names scrolling up at the end of the video. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below.